and it was having some feedback. So it's good to be with you again. I'm Nathan Hosser. I direct the Office of Peacebuilding Policy for the Church of the Brethren and co-convener of the Interfaith Working Group on Drone Warfare. I'm here with several panelists, which I'll introduce, and my co-convener, Holly Metcalf, from the General Board of Church and Society from the United Methodist Church. I'll start us off, and then the panelists will go, and then Holly will take over at that point with the question and answer time. Our outline for today, to give you a little glimpse into what we're aiming at, is we will start with Daphne Ivitar from Amnesty International. She's Director of Security and Human Rights. She'll focus on legal questions around the issue of use of drones and lethal strikes, etc. Then we'll turn to Annie Scheel from Civic, Centers for Civilians in Conflict, where she works with policymakers and lawmakers to enhance civilian protections. She'll take the policy end of our discussion today. And then we'll turn to Pauline Muchina, who is the Policy Education and Advocacy Coordinator for Africa for the American Friends Service Committee here in DC. And she'll take the theological, ethical end of this. And then in a bit of a twist on this typical question time, rather than the facilitators primarily asking questions, we'll invite the panelists to turn to each other and ask questions. Again, our point today is both to raise concerns and questions and provide some answers when thinking about U.S. lethal drone policy, and then to see how these various streams of thinking, legal, policy, theological, ethical, influence and enhance and strengthen our arguments and thinking about this. This is a second of a three-part series. The first was earlier in the year, focusing on voices from affected communities as well as drone operators. This one is taking a bit higher level look at, as noted, the legal, policy and theological elements of this question. And then in the new year, we'll have one focusing specifically on advocacy to Congress, giving some more practical, not that today isn't practical, but practical kind of how to and kind of talking points and ways to think through this. So stay tuned for that. We don't have a date finalized on that yet, but we will have that to you shortly. So with that, I will turn first to Daphne.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And thank you, Nathan and Holly, for organizing this. I think it's great to put all of these different aspects of the issue together. So it's not just law or policy or theology, but all together. So I've really appreciated thinking about that, but I will give you a summary of the relevant. I'm going to focus on the international law, although I will touch on domestic law as well. But the relevant international law when it comes to drone warfare is first what people call IHL, International Humanitarian Law. Those are the laws of war. They come out of the Geneva Conventions and many other treaties and common and policy that has developed over the years. But the Geneva Conventions is what most people are familiar with. That's the law that governs the use of lethal force in armed conflict. So under that law, you can lethally target enemy combatants or the people who are fighters on the other side, on the group that you're fighting. Then there's international human rights law. International human rights law governs the use of force outside of armed conflict. And under international human rights law, lethal force is permissible only if it's necessary to prevent an imminent attack on human life. I should just mention as an aside that the United States does not recognize the extraterritorial applicability of international human rights law, which means they don't think that they're bound by it outside of US territory. So although that they don't explicitly say that when they talk about their policy, it's worth keeping that in mind. Most countries in the world believe that it does apply outside of their own borders, and that is the common understanding among legal scholars as well. So are drones legal? Well, it depends. Drones can be used lawfully in armed conflict, so long as they're only targeting combatants or legitimate military objectives. So that would be, say, an enemy weapons depot or supply line, something like that. You have to take precautions to protect civilians and not cause disproportionate harm, as with any other weapon system. More controversial is the use of drones outside of recognized armed conflicts. So, for example, drones are regularly used in Somalia now to target al-Shabaab, which is considered an affiliate of al-Qaeda. That's largely under the radar of the US public, though, so you don't hear a lot about it. One highly publicized example, though, of a drone use that's just sort of a good example of the legal issues is when the US used a drone to kill Ayman al-Zawahiri and Afghanistan in July. So Zawahiri was a high-level al-Qaeda leader. He was believed to have been the deputy to Osama bin Laden. U.S. killed him in a drone attack. They say they killed no civilians. Very popular. But the U.S. is no longer engaged in an active armed conflict in Afghanistan. So what legal authority did it have to go in and use a drone to take out Zawahiri? Did he pose an imminent threat would be the next question you'd normally ask under human rights law. So the U.S. didn't actually claim that Zawahiri was an imminent threat. It just said he was a legitimate target as a leader of al-Qaeda. And this is because the U.S. says it's engaged in an ongoing war on terror, which they've sort of redefined as a war against al-Qaeda and its affiliates. That war started in 2001 when Congress issued an authorization to use military force to invade Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. 21 years later, the U.S. says that war is ongoing and global. And this is where U.S. Legal interpretation most significantly diverges from common understandings of international law globally. So IHL, or the laws of war, presume a defined war against a defined enemy in a particular place. But with this war on terror that the US has created, they've created a new concept of a global war against al-Qaeda and its affiliates, whoever and wherever they may be. And the affiliates of al-Qaeda change all the time. And and who is defined as an affiliate is controversial. Ultimately, it's a very dangerously broad definition of armed conflict because it has no geographical limits and it has no end. So this is where the use of drones is so problematic. It allows the US to engage in limitless war against constantly changing armed groups anywhere in the world. And it does so at very little immediate human cost to US troops. So as a result, very little political cost in the United States. Ground wars tend to be much more risky to US personnel. They're more visible, and they're politically less popular. So the Zawahiri strike was celebrated. Biden announced it with a lot of pride and fanfare, but it probably wasn't legal under international law. So this might sound to some people like legal quibbling. I mean, Zawahiri was a notorious terrorist, so why does it matter, right? It matters because US erodes the rule of law globally by redefining it for its own purposes. It's not just the US that has drones, and US motives and actions are not always commendable. Also, are the costs to the US really so low? US drone strikes seem to be perpetuating and even intensifying conflicts rather than ending them. In Somalia, for example, the US has been conducting drone strikes for years against al-Shabaab, an affiliate of al-Qaeda. The Trump administration killed many civilians in Somalia. Amnesty International documented some of them. It's a hard place to do research, but we were able to document dozens of cases that the US killed civilians and never acknowledged them, provided no reparations, no assistance to victims. During the first year of the Biden administration, we were hopeful because the US seemed to put strikes on pause. We saw there were actually, I think, none or maybe one attack in the first year of the Biden administration. And we saw many fewer attacks by al-Shabaab. Over the past year, the US has significantly increased the number of drone strikes in Somalia, killing dozens of what it claims are al-Shabaab militants. And we don't know actually who gets killed because we don't have the information other than what the US government provides. But they claim they've killed only al-Shabaab militants. In response, we've seen al-Shabaab dramatically increase the number of its attacks. So clearly US drone strikes are not bringing about an end to the conflict in Somalia, and they don't seem to have ended conflict anywhere else. They might be making it worse. So that's a summary of the legal issues, but that's why I'm really happy that we're not just talking about the legal issues, that we're also talking about the strategic and moral issues. So I'll pass that on to Annie.
Thank you so much, Daphne. Should I just jump right in? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Scheel from Center for Civilians in Conflict. And to add on to what Daphne said, I'm just going to speak about some of the policy issues at hand and also the current policy state of play. So Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC, as our name suggests, we focus on protecting civilians harmed in conflict around the world. And so that kind of, civilian first lens is really where we come from with these issues. In terms of the policy landscape, we've seen, of course, as Daphne described really well, over 2 decades now of endless war, which has featured a significant reliance on airstrikes both inside and outside of what would be deemed war zones. And over that time, successive presidents have claimed this unilateral power to authorize oftentimes very secretive killing outside of these recognized battlefields. And so on that legal basis that Daphne laid out, Civic and many of our partners have opposed the continuation of that secretive program of strikes, often drone strikes, outside of recognized war zones. And of course, beyond the legal issues at play, this is also a policy decision to continue to reach for a war-based tool to solve specific security or foreign policy problems. And while Civic doesn't typically advocate around decisions to go to war, we do deal with significant consequences from those decisions to reach for these specific tools. And of course, as I mentioned, our focus is on the civilian impact. And what we have seen there is for nearly 2 decades of this program and of these endless wars, both inside and outside of what we would consider war zones. We've seen significant civilian casualties, deaths and injuries, and also other forms of harm, like significant psychological harm. Particularly when we talk about drones, people are aware of constant buzzing overhead. People are aware that at any time they could be targeted without understanding why that is. We also see other forms of reverberating harms. For example, damage and destruction of schools or hospitals or essential infrastructure and essential services. We've also seen with the majority of those 20 years, that the US has regularly failed to adequately prevent civilian harm from these operations and also to meaningfully respond with rigorous investigations, with transparency, with amends, including condolence payments. And then, of course, many other impacts like that other groups have documented really well, like economic impacts, regional destabilization, mass displacement, and really just the continuation of cycles of violence. So that's a lot of what we've seen. I do want to touch quickly on the current state of play in the policy realm. So right now, the Biden administration recently finalized the Presidential Policy Memorandum, or the PPM, which is its version of a policy governing the use of lethal force outside of what the area calls areas of active hostility. So essentially, to Daphne's points, outside of war zones. The policy appears to be similar to past policies, particularly the Obama version, meaning that fundamentally it does further entrench this program of undertaking strikes outside of recognized war zones against people suspected of terrorism, right? Thinking about that human rights law frame that Daphne laid out. But really importantly, we don't actually know for sure exactly what it contains because it has been kept secret. So all that we really know about the policy is what's been reported by the New York Times. So first and foremost, we have a huge transparency issue. Previous administrations' policies have been made public with redactions, demonstrating that it is possible to provide that level of transparency. So we and our partners, including Amnesty, are pushing for that transparency as well. The other policy development I'll mention that is quite a bit more positive is that we now have from the Department of Defense the first ever Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan, known by its very elegant acronym, the CHIMRAP, which lays out an ambitious plan for how the DoD, the Department of Defense, will prevent and respond to civilian harm in the future. So in that policy area, a lot is still needed, of course, to ensure proper and prompt implementation of that plan. And also to ensure that just as the US looks forward at preventing and responding to civilian harm in the future, it doesn't lose sight of accountability for past harms. And the last thing I'll note here is that action plan, it's a Department of Defense plan. So it does not apply to CIA strikes. And CIA strikes pose significant challenges to transparency, to the rule of law, to public consent about the use of force, and of course to civilians. So civilians who are harmed in CIA strikes, for example, rarely, if ever, receive any kind of acknowledgement or accountability for their harm because of the secretive nature of those strikes. So that's another big policy area in terms of oversight over CIA strikes, but ultimately, ensuring that the use of lethal force resides with the Department of Defense and not with a secretive agency like the CIA. So I will stop there, but really looking forward to the discussion. And thank you so much again for having me and for being here.
Okay. So thank you very much. Wow, great information from the presenters. I'm so glad to be sharing the platform with you today. And listening to both of you present, I'm thinking, you know, it's amazing because the theology and the policy and the legal issue overlap with each other. And so I'm going to focus on theology and moral, but, you know, I'll be referring to some of the things that you mentioned. So this week, my good friend Bonnie Holcomb from the Presbyterian Church reminded me of this biblical text, and I read it. When the days drew near for him to be received up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But the people would not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to bid fire come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. Did Jesus condemn the use of drones and rebuke his disciples, as my friend Bonnie believes, and I tend to believe so? The disciples were ready to rain fire from heaven, but Jesus said no. I can imagine how stunned the disciples were by this rebuke, especially since they thought it was justified, like many of us, you know, think that war is justified. Would Jesus' rebuke carry weight or any weight in our society today as we rain fire from above on all our enemies or our enemies indiscriminately and also in covert ways, assassinating terrorists that have or may threaten us without any due process or, you know, giving them a chance to defend themselves? So the just war theory taught by the church fathers, such as Ambrose, Aquinas, and Augustine, and also solidified by Gratian, you know, since the 13th century has kind of accepted war as a necessary evil. And many traditions, whether it is Christian or, Jewish or Muslim, other faith traditions, Protestants and Catholics, they all seem to agree on the just war theory. This theory has many proponents, but it has some principles that have to be followed. One, it must have a cause. Any war has to have a cause, be a last resort, be declared by the right authority, must possess the right intention. The warring state has a reasonable choice or chance of success, and the end is proportional to the means used. When you think about the use of drones and you put it, you know, on the scale of just war, just war theory, you see that it doesn't align. Just war calls for the protection of civilians or innocent citizens, and also calls on the fighters to think of the moral consequences of their actions and protect lives, the culture, the traditions, and laws of their enemies. The just war theory puts power under control and recognizes the importance of human dignity during the time of war. Other traditions that don't ascribe to just war theory, such as the Quakers, use a nonviolent approach where war is never an option. And if you look at the use of drones, even from the just war perspective, you realize that it violates all the principles of just war that I just listed. It is beyond the just war theory, as it is mainly practiced outside the realm of war. And also it is done on countries where the US is not waging war. It is also used predominantly among Muslim countries and targets Muslim men as young as 14 years old. It is used as a punishment for those who perceived to be a threat to the US and engages in a preventive war without clear proof that an attack from the targeted individual is imminent. It is not the last resort by far, and the end is never proportional to the means. A UN report states that the use of killer drones undermines the protection of life in the immediate and longer terms and make it easier for states to deploy deadly and targeted force, and mainly outside the US. All the attacks happen outside the US and in most cases where the US is not at war. The use of killer drones undermines human rights law, the right to life, which is sacred to all faith tradition. It has civilian casualties, raising the moral question of the protection to life for communities impacted by drones through killings, maiming, displacement, or destruction of property. It overlooks social barriers in society against the deployment of lethal force and result in attempts to weaken relevant legal standards. It also infringes on other territories without regard, as I said before. It does not seek permission. The US doesn't seek permission to send drones to Somalia, and they kill indiscriminately, and it also affects non-militants. It cuts out human nature, which is supposed to serve as a check on lethal violence. They argue that face-to-face combat, gives the human ability to see the other person, and it takes more than a switch to override empathy and proceed to the destruction of life. It doesn't always have to be the right authorities. For example, US doesn't go to Congress to get approval. Also, remember we say that they are preventive war without clear proof that an attack is imminent. And of course, the secrecy of use of drones make it impossible for people of faith to apply moral challenge to their use. The Bible, the Quran, Torah, and other religious texts call for peace, mercy, compassion, empathy, and love. In fact, most advocate for giving peace a chance before engaging in war. For example, the Torah says, as Jews drew close to battle, they are commanded to act with mercy and must offer their opponent terms of peace. Every enemy must be given a way out before an attack, not to just be attacked from the sky without knowing. In all traditions, the right to life, protection of civilians, limitation of the damage to lives, especially of civilians, must be observed. No matter how offended, believers must maintain human norms, even as they wage war against their enemies. I work for AFSC that, operates from Quaker values, respecting the equality, worth, and dignity of all people, and regard no one as an enemy. I can go on and on to tell you more about how these drones do not align with most traditions and also the just war theory. However, as a womanist theologian, I believe that the use of drones jeopardizes critical moral values in our society, and that are supposed to be guiding our lives. Things like love, empathy, dignity, compassion, and justice. In our world today, it is hard to speak of these virtues without being labeled a pacifist. Self-interest and the need to protect and defend overrides any notions of self-evaluation, compassion, empathy, love, and even humility. We strike anyone, anywhere, anytime. We don't care much about people whose lives are destroyed with a click of a switch. I join my colleagues in the working group and the faith community to look for a prophetic voice to bring back the discussion on moral values in the use of lethal drones. I leave you with these questions. Who are we in relationship to God's creatures? Where is compassion, empathy, human dignity in our actions, especially in the use of drones? And should we, as people of faith, remain silent as our brothers and sisters live in constant fear of when the next killer drone will strike? Or do we say to our government, not in our name? In Somalia, where we work, communities are devastated all the time, and their suffering and pain should be a cause for our concern. And we cannot continue as if, where the US has the right to continue doing what they are doing around the world. Targeting killing is also unethical, and the US is doing it all the time. When you're actually targeting men as young as 14 years, what right do you have? You're violating international laws, and definitely you are violating humanity and the law from God. Thank you.
Thank you to all the presenters. We will transition to the time where presenters ask questions, and as noted in the chat, we will also then take questions. If you have questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A section, and we will be monitoring that and raising those to the speakers. So I'll first ask Annie to ask a question of Pauline, then Pauline of Daphne, and then Daphne of Annie.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for that, Pauline. I think one thing that strikes me as I hear you speaking is that, I think sometimes in the policy advocacy world, we can sometimes take the moral foundations of our work for granted and sometimes focus on really wonky, policy or legal or strategic implications of the issues we work on, sometimes even, to be seen as more credible when we work on these issues. And so much of the value of your work and what you've just been talking about is to help us ask and hopefully answer some of those bigger moral questions about our work, and to make sure that those are the questions that are at the forefront of people's minds as they grapple with what can often sound like really wonky or really hard to grasp issues, especially if we don't work on this, day in, day out. So I guess my question for you is, can you talk more about how you approach asking those bigger moral and ethical questions, and what can we do to help, everyday people who maybe don't work on this issue every day to understand the ethical implications of what we're talking about when it can be so wonky. So that's my question to you.
Thank you. I think it is a big challenge because it's not, you don't have easy answers unless you go back to the tradition of saving lives, of being just, of giving everybody a chance, of compassion, of love, so that you are realizing that my well-being is tied up with the other person's well-being, and therefore whatever I do has consequences, not only to the people I'm attacking, but to me as a country or a society, because ultimately we are all answerable to our Creator. And if, as a country, we neglect that conversation of saying we are doing killings of 14 years old just because we see them as a threat, and are we not violating God's law of love and compassion and understanding? And obviously, we are violating the just war theory, because we are not, and most of us actually prescribe to that. But, the drones are not a last resort by any means. Usually they are used to punish most of the time, and to prevent something that is thought that maybe they may be a threat, and maybe they lead an organization that's committing crimes, and they can go on and kill anybody in the world based on that perspective. So the moral question for us, and the bigger ones, is humility for me. Let's be humble to recognize the humanity of everyone in each person. And then from that perspective, I'm not saying that we shouldn't protect ourselves, but I am saying let's not be too quick to judge and to assassinate or execute people around the world the way we are doing it right now. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I wanted to ask. So it's my turn to ask Daphne. So Daphne, this is a question that I always wrestle with. You talked about the US not really being bound by international law outside the United States. And yet, most of the anti-law activities that they commit are outside the United States. So how do we then hold them accountable when it comes to issues of international law, but especially on human rights issues like assassinating people before they are taken to court and let them defend themselves?
Thank you, Pauline, for that question. I mean, it's a really difficult question because the US has so much power, and we can talk about laws, but how they're enforced has a lot to do with power. And so it is very hard to hold the US accountable under international law. I think what does happen, though, and we're seeing with the Biden administration, they are paying attention to how other countries view them, particularly their allies, but even the ability for the US to criticize Russia now, for example, is related to what human rights abuses has the US committed? What moral ground does it have to stand on? And even though there isn't a very solid, enforceable legal structure that can hold the US government accountable, because it's not a member of the International Criminal Court, there is an Inter-American Human Rights Commission, but it doesn't have a lot of authority to bind the US. It's funny, in a way, moral authority and legal authority really combine here. And I think we have what's called customary international law, which really develops as countries apply and interpret the law, and it becomes sort of moral persuasion. And it becomes less and less acceptable for the US government to do certain things. So we've seen in the current administration, this is just a small example. For example, the US in the past has been very reluctant to sign on to treaties, international treaties that limit the way that it conducts warfare. So the Biden administration just signed on to a convention. I don't remember, it's not exactly a treaty, I forget what the name of it is, but the idea is to limit the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. A political declaration, thank you, Annie. So what that means is the US government has officially said, we need to pay more attention to how we use explosive weapons in populated areas, like in cities. The US, in the past and under the Trump administration, the US killed thousands of civilians in Syria and Iraq, in major cities, using drone strikes, airstrikes, all sorts of artillery, massive explosive artillery. It was incredibly destructive. The Trump administration was not going to limit that. The Biden administration, to its credit, is looking more towards international law, is more agreeable to considering limitations on its use of force. Now, that's not enforceable, really, but it does create moral and legal norms that make it harder for the next administration, for the next president to come in and reverse them. So in a sense, it's more norms and morality and public pressure that will limit the US government than an enforcement of international law. But it's interesting, and just one last thought about international law, it's very much tied to a lot of the moral questions that you talked about, just war theory and the way to treat prisoners of war. It's all very tied. So these things are really not separable. Should I go ahead and ask Annie a question, or it looks like we have questions for Pauline?
I think you continue with your question to Annie, and then we'll go back through. There's a number of questions coming in that will give us plenty to keep talking about for the next 15 or 20 minutes.
Okay, thanks. So Annie, there's so many policy issues involved in drone strikes, but one thing I'm struck by is the secrecy of US strikes and how that seems to make it very difficult to advocate at all, because when you don't know what the US government is doing, it's hard to say, well, you should do something differently. So for example, Amnesty will go in and say, well, it looks like war crimes have been committed, but we can't prove it because we don't have the information. So I know that in the past, the US has said, well, we can't release information about how we conduct warfare because that would just help our enemies. So what's your response to that? Why does transparency matter? And how can the US be more transparent without helping their so-called enemies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the transparency piece, as you just noted, is fundamental to all the other questions, because how do we advocate on something without that transparency, right? How do we know what's in this new policy without transparency? How do civilians understand what happened and why to their loved one without transparency? And how do we get accountability for it? So I think to your question, I mean, first and foremost, transparency is something that is owed to the American people and also to, you know, all people affected by these strikes outside of the United States, around the world, as a matter of war powers. I mean, that is not something Civic works on, but as a, you know, a US citizen, I mean, the issue of war powers, you know, we deserve information about where the US is using force. And because of, you know, separation of powers, we deserve to have a voice in where the US goes to war. And I think there's actually a really great question in the chat about how to help more people understand this, you know, and part of my question to Pauline is a selfish one, because it is so wonky and it can be so hard to make this an issue that people, you know, understand how it affects them and how it affects other people. But so often, you know, I think continuous, you know, successive administrations really get away with not talking very much about this. And so it kind of fades into the foreground. So transparency is essential for that reason. And I think that we've seen actually, you know, there are a lot of cases, I sometimes am surprised, where there are many cases where transparency, I think, helps the US military when it does try to make the case that it does a lot to protect civilians, right? The more that the US can be transparent, the more trust we have in how it responds to civilian harm, right? So right now we have a lot of scenarios where, you know, the Kabul strike, for example, that was a civilian casualty incident, an aid worker working for a US organization, and many children killed in this drone strike as the US was evacuating from Afghanistan. That was obviously a very high profile strike that many people saw on their screens. And to this day, we don't have publicly the results of that investigation. And so when the US says, you know, it was a mistake, but it was also a righteous strike at the time, all the things they say about that, we have no way of knowing if that's true. And in fact, all the information that we look at suggests that that's not the case. We also have seen in a lot of media reporting in incidents since then, many media organizations saying the US said there were no civilian casualties, but we've seen time and time again that it has come out later that there are civilian casualties. So lack of transparency really erodes trust in what the US government is saying about its operations, and the efforts that it goes to protect civilians. So that it would be my answer to them is, US government is constantly concerned about misinformation and propaganda from, its adversaries. Well, the best tool that you have to combat that is to be transparent about what you're doing, and who you're harming.
Thank you, Annie. I'm going to turn us to some of the questions from the chat. Thanks for sending in your questions, guys. Please continue to add them there. I thought maybe we could start with this question about the notion of imminent threat, and how the US is using this idea of imminent threat as kind of a catch-all. It seems to pertain to anyone who's affiliated with a group that may have attacked, that may have committed attacks in the past. I wonder if you guys could comment a little bit on what imminent threat means and whether that definition has evolved over time, and what that means as far as our drones advocacy work. Daphne, maybe we could start with you on this one.
Sure. I'm happy to start with it. It's a really good question because it's been very controversial in the legal circles about what does that mean. So imminent threat means, as it says, a threat, something is about to happen. And under international law, it means this thing is about to happen. Someone's about to pull the trigger or about to throw a bomb or something like that. And that is when lethal force to prevent that from happening can be permissible outside of armed conflict, or obviously within armed conflict as well. What the US government has done, again, kind of twisting the law for its own purposes, is, and we don't know exactly how it's defining this now. We know from the past how it's defined it in the past, but it's, as Annie said, they haven't released their new legal standards. In the past, they've talked about they will target someone who presents an ongoing imminent threat, which is sort of internally contradictory. Like if it's ongoing, it's not imminent. And what they seem to be talking about are people like Zawahiri, who, because of their leadership in a group that the US has been fighting for 20 years, they assume is a threat. But that doesn't meet the legal definition of imminent. Because they've created that really elastic concept of imminent, they can, as you said, kind of target anyone who they say is affiliated with a group that they think is fighting the United States. Now, it's worth noting a lot of the groups that the US is fighting, such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia, are not fighting the United States. So the US has intervened in this war, and it's not a war against us. So that raises even more questions. Who is the imminent threat towards, and is this actually resolving or preventing the harm that could be caused by that imminent threat?
Thanks, Daphne. Did anyone else want to comment on imminent threat before I move us to our next question? Okay. I see a question in the chat about folks who have a different interpretation of Christianity and maybe a different understanding of war. I think we could expand this question out to include all Americans who maybe see the use of force differently. And I'm wondering, everyone touched on it a little bit in their presentations, but we often hear this argument that drones are a necessary evil, that protect American lives, that we need drone warfare to keep Americans safe. I wonder if each of you could maybe take a stab at that particular question from your perspective. How would you respond to someone that says that? And I wonder if, Pauline, maybe we could start with you on this one.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. There is a diversity of understanding of theology, but the predominantly one, you will find that it is just war. And it's not that it's a theory that has already passed. It's actually current. And a lot of denominations or traditions have it as their guiding principles in terms of how they engage with the world and how they perceive war. But it is also done in the context of a very complex situation where people have to wrestle with, whether their security, guarantees or gives their governments permission to act, with lethal force without consulting them or without marking the right principles of just war, or protecting life, for example, is one of them, and that will never become outdated. Protecting life is always something that we all agree with. But Americans, and now I'm one of them because I'm a citizen, we tend to take away that responsibility from ourselves and give it to the government. We don't even hold our denominations or our traditions accountable for helping us to think through, so that we actually understand that when the government of the US is fighting outside on our behalf, that we have the right to know exactly what they are doing, who they are targeting, and whether they are actually making everything possible to ensure that the people perceived as our enemies are real enemies, and also that we are still practicing human rights and justice on them, even as we try to defend ourselves. So it's a very complicated issue, and especially when you are saying, is it imminent or not? What comes to mind immediately is it is not. because when we see it in Somalia, where they are sending drones and destroying communities, maiming them, displacing them, young children's life being cut off before their lives begin. You know, I feel people who talk about, you know, for example, things like abortion and say they want to protect life. Why can't they be as adamant about protecting the lives of people who are being killed with drones from above? Women who are pregnant, dying in the process because of an action that our government did in a foreign country like Somalia. I'll leave it at that. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm happy to add just a couple of things onto that really helpful answer. And I'll speak as Annie rather than as my organization. But I do think it's, you know, it's really important to have more conversations as a country about, has investing in the use of force made us safer? And there are, you know, all the issues we already discussed around, you know, eroding the rule of law and civilian harm and all of these issues, but also at a time when the biggest threats that many Americans are facing are pandemics or climate change, or, you know, all of these things that require significant investments. I think that's one really important question to answer is, has this made us safer? And certainly we know that there are significant consequences to safety and security from these programs as well. You know, certainly we know, I think that harm begets harm, and that we've seen that when we create civilian casualties, when we harm civilians, we create, you know, really deep grievances in societies that continue to, you know, foment conflict and lead people to continue cycles of violence. So, you know, I think we've seen over 20 years of reaching for these tools at the expense of other tools that I would say it has not made us safer. It has created significant harm and continued cycles of violence. So I will leave it there.
And actually, every time the US uses drones in Somalia, the Al-Shabaab in Somalia gets the opportunity to recruit young men to continue the fight, because they watch their families being killed. They watch their families being displaced. So they pick up arms, and Al-Shabaab is very convincing. If you're being told, you know, they hate you because you're Muslim, and secondly, there is evidence that they are attacking you from the air, you can't even defend yourself. So you find young people in Somalia being recruited by the actions of the United States.
Daphne, did you want to jump in to respond to the accusation that, or the assertion that drones save American lives and thus make Americans safer?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to follow on what Pauline just said, because it's so powerful and so I think really just the most important point, that it is making things worse. But I do want to just point out, so that drones in themselves, they're not illegal, they're not even necessarily immoral. It depends how you're using them. And so the question is, you know, there could be the use of drones in an armed conflict, or maybe if there's a really truly imminent threat outside of an armed conflict, where you could safely use a drone to eliminate someone who's about to, you know, plant a bomb and destroy blow up a lot of people or something. Theoretically, it can be used in that way. The weapon system itself isn't the problem, but what we've seen is that the way it's used, because it's so easy for the US to use, it's relatively inexpensive and it doesn't threaten US troops directly, and it's politically popular. What we've seen is exactly what Pauline has described and what Annie has described. We've seen the use in Somalia in situations where they're actually killing women, children, farmers, with very little knowledge really of even who they're killing or what's going on the ground, which is something that the US military is not very good at knowing when it's, especially when it doesn't have troops on the ground, even knowing what the local scenario is, who's who, what's what are people doing there. They see it from a plane remotely. The US Africa Command is based in Germany. So it's really a very disconnected way of conducting a war. And so I guess just the short answer is just that the drones can be used legally. They could theoretically be used morally, but because they're so easy to use for the US and not just the US, other countries are increasingly using them. They're being used much more expansively as kind of political tools. And that's where it becomes extremely dangerous for all of us.
We've got time for one more question, and I noticed several of the questions in the chat are related to the lack of outrage or interest on behalf of Americans in relation to this issue, that it seems like people aren't paying attention, that it seems like there's not a lot of folks standing up on this issue. And I know Nate alluded a bit to our upcoming webinar in the new year that'll focus a little more on practical action. But I wonder if in the time remaining, if any of our panelists have specific suggestions about how to encourage folks to really learn about this, to get interested in this, particularly for folks that maybe aren't in DC or aren't well versed on federal policy. This can often seem like a complicated issue. So what do you suggest for getting people engaged?
I mean, one thing I'm happy to just jump in with is I don't think that most members of Congress hear from their constituents about this issue at all. And I know from a fact, from working with Congress, that it makes a big difference when they hear from people, when they know that their constituents care about how the US is using force in other countries. So that's the first thing. And I know that both Daphne and Pauline's organizations have fantastic grassroots efforts that I'm sure folks could plug into. So I will stop and let them talk. But I do think that that voicing concerns and letting your representatives know this is an issue you care about actually has quite a bit of impact.
Yes, and actually, our working group, the Interfaith Working Group on Drones, has resources that we can share, and maybe even some, if we can put them on the chat. We have, like, for example, documentaries, videos, people of faith discussing how this is morally wrong and how they are struggling with it. But I think the first step would be for everyone who wants to be active on this to educate themselves, and educate others in their community using the materials that we can provide. And then we can also work with them to organize letter writings to Congress, or even visits to their office, their representative offices, to talk about this. Because even sometimes you find even staff members of Congress who don't understand what is happening. Just like the general population, you're not gonna hear this in the media. You're not gonna just jump in an internet page and you find it. So we need to mobilize ourselves to educate, and share information. Even on a Sunday morning service, we need to hear people preaching about it in a mosque, in Jewish synagogues and other places, in theological schools, where this can be taught, so that when people get out, they are relating to the communities and educating them to do the same thing, so that they can advocate. If we don't do that, it will continue to be a secret of what the US is doing outside, and never really being held accountable by its own citizens. Because at this point, the international community doesn't have the power, in my opinion, to hold the US accountable as best as they can. It is the US citizens who can do that. And to do that, we need to educate ourselves. Thank you.
I couldn't possibly say it better than that. I mean, that's absolutely true. Amnesty does do outreach on this. I mean, we have a lot of reports also. So I think Amnesty has done a lot of on the ground reports where we send in researchers and we interview people after conflicts to find out what happened. And that is often how we find that there were thousands of civilians killed in Syria, for example, by US airstrikes. or there have been at least dozens of people killed in Somalia by US airstrikes that we've documented and that the US has denied in many cases. In some cases, they might later acknowledge years later that maybe there was a civilian death, but they take no responsibility for it. So we have a lot of information on our website. We have reports on US actions in Somalia and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. We have an online action, which I'd be happy to share with people if they'd like. It is on our website as well, that targets President Biden. And I want to reiterate Annie's point, call your member of Congress. It is probably the most effective way to call attention to this issue. That, and even just call the White House, because they need to hear from constituents. And it really is the US public that will influence this more than any sort of legal body can do.
And I think that the other thing to remember is that we are seeing it at the low end of it. It is going to escalate, especially because the US is modeling what other countries can do. And the more they have access to those weapons, especially the drones, the more danger we will have in the world. So this is the time for us to speak up and say enough is enough. And also, you know, countries such as Ethiopia can easily turn them against its own people, which is what is happening right now in Ethiopia and in other countries like Syria, where they use drones to actually go and kill. But they can hide behind the United States, the big power. If the US can do it, then we can also do it. So we as US citizens have to say, no, not in our name. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all the panelists and people attending. We invite you, as has been noted, this has been recorded and is online. So we invite you to share it with friends and colleagues to help raise concern and engage in this. I won't respond to some of the questions or comments, but just noting that our strategy or theory of doing this and having multiple streams and thinking, both within each of these bodies of policy, legal, and theology, is to highlight arguments that we come across regularly in this work and things that will need to be responded to, and recognize that there are differing strategies for making changes and arguing against this or raising questions about it. And so even if you are present and feel some discomfort with certain lines of argument in this, these are the types of things that will be addressed and will need to be responded to. And so we invite you to engage with this in that way. And as noted, we will have an additional webinar early in the year focusing on very practical actions. So please stay tuned to that. If you've registered for this, we will both send you that information, some follow-up materials, and then look forward to future engagement. Thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.